For decades, we were told this was just an Appalachian legend. We were wrong. High in the ridges of East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia, in the folds of the Cumberland Mountains, there has always lived a people the maps never quite knew how to name. Neighbors called them Melungeons. Nobody, including the Melungeons themselves, could say for certain where the name came from, or where the people came from, and for over 200 years, that not knowing was treated as a footnote, a curiosity, a mountain oddity. It was not. It was the edge of one of the most quietly explosive stories in American genetic history. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what the Melungeons looked like to the outside world, and what that looking cost them. Early travelers into the Appalachian backcountry in the late 1700s and early 1800s described a population that did not fit the racial categories the young United States was busy inventing. Not clearly white, not clearly black, not clearly Native American. Olive or dark-complexioned skin, in some cases described as having straight or wavy dark hair, features that census takers and tax collectors did not have a box for. In a country that was, at that very moment, writing laws entirely around the binary of black and white, a population that fit neither was not just unusual, it was dangerous to the system and to itself. So the explanations came, one after another, each one more elaborate than the last. Descendants of shipwrecked Portuguese sailors, descendants of the lost colony of Roanoke, descendants of Turkish or Moorish traders, descendants of a lost tribe of Israel, descendants of Sir Francis Drake's abandoned crew. Some of these stories the Melungeons told about themselves, passed down as oral tradition. Some were imposed on them by outsiders looking for any explanation that did not require confronting the obvious. Because the obvious explanation, that this was a population descended in part from free and enslaved Africans who had intermarried with European settlers and indigenous people in the earliest, least regulated years of the colonial frontier, was not a story white Appalachia in the 19th and early 20th centuries was prepared to accept. Admitting it would have meant admitting that neighbors, landowners, even legislators, had African ancestry hiding inside supposedly white bloodlines. So instead, an entire mythology was built. Anything but that. This was not just gossip or suspicion. It was written into law. When Tennessee held its constitutional convention in 1834, one of the questions on the floor was whether free persons of color could keep the right to vote, a right some had held since the state's founding. Melungeon families were caught directly in that debate. Court cases across the region, in Hawkins and Hancock counties, existed for the sole purpose of legally determining, family by family, whether a person was white enough to vote, to testify against a white man, to marry who they wished. In some of these trials, the deciding evidence was not paperwork. It was the shape of a fingernail, the color of a gum line, examined in open court by men with no scientific training and every incentive to reach the answer that preserved the existing order. For nearly 2 centuries, this was where the story sat. A frozen anomaly, explained away by legend, sustained by silence, and in some cases enforced by law. Then the genetics arrived, and it did not confirm the legends. It confirmed the thing the legends had been built to avoid. The first serious DNA study came in 2012, when researchers Roberta Estes, Jack Goins, Penny Ferguson, and Janet Lewis Crane published a genetic analysis in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy examining Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA from documented Melungeon lineages. Families whose descent could be traced back through court records to the earliest identified Melungeon households of the 1700s. The question was simple. What do the oldest Melungeon paternal and maternal lines actually carry? The Y chromosome results, tracing purely male line ancestry back to the earliest fathers, were the moment everything changed. A significant portion of the earliest documented Melungeon paternal lines carried haplogroups consistent with sub-Saharan African origin, not vague, not ambiguous. Specific lineages tracing back to African ancestry, paired on the maternal side largely with European haplogroups. In plain terms, The data pointed toward African men and European women forming some of the earliest Melungeon households, at a time and in a place where such unions were not just socially fraught but, within a few decades, would become criminal. This is the detail that reframes the entire narrative. This was not simply a story of racial mixing in the abstract. It was a story with a direction. In the earliest colonial Chesapeake and Virginia frontier, before slavery had fully hardened into the rigid, racialized, lifelong system it would become by the mid-1700s, indentured servitude was fluid. Free and indentured Africans, European indentured servants, and indigenous people worked the same land, often under the same brutal conditions, with far more social proximity than the plantation south that came later. Marriages and unions across those lines happened, and for a narrow historical window, they were not yet fully outlawed. Then the laws changed. Virginia and neighboring colonies began passing statutes in the late 1600s and early 1800s, criminalizing interracial marriage and defining race in increasingly rigid, hereditary terms specifically to close off the fluidity that had existed before. Families caught on the wrong side of that new legal line had a choice that was barely a choice at all. Stay and be reclassified, taxed, and legally degraded under the new racial codes, or move. Many moved west into the mountains, into the least governed, least surveyed corners of the frontier, where county clerks rarely traveled and colonial law had the thinnest reach. That westward drift into the Blue Ridge and the Cumberlands was not a random settlement pattern. It was, in a very real sense, a flight from a legal system that had just redefined who they were allowed to be. And the danger did not end with the colonial period. It sharpened again 200 years later. In 1924, Virginia passed the Racial Integrity Act, one of the strictest one-drop laws ever written into American statute, enforced with near-fanatical zeal by a state registrar named Walter Plecker, who spent decades combing birth and marriage records looking for families he believed were passing as white. Mountain communities with mixed ancestry, Melungeon families among them, were squarely in his sights. Being formally reclassified under Plecker's registry could mean a marriage annulled after the fact, a birth certificate altered, a family's legal identity rewritten by a bureaucrat who had never met them. This is where isolation, the same word that shows up in so many of these stories, meant something different than it usually does. The Melungeons were not preserved by isolation. They were produced by it, driven into it deliberately, by people trying to outrun a legal definition of race that threatened to dissolve their families, their land claims, and their freedom. And once in the mountains, something else happened. Cut off from courthouses and censuses, several generations of Melungeon families began, quietly and pragmatically, to reclassify themselves. Tax records and census entries show individuals and entire family lines shifting over decades from categories like mulatto or free-colored to white, not because their ancestry had changed, but because the isolation of the mountains gave them room to renegotiate, on paper, what the lowland world would never have permitted. The 2012 study and subsequent broader autosomal testing done through consumer genealogy platforms over the following decade confirmed this pattern was not confined to one or two families. It ran through founding lineages with names like Gibson, Collins, Bunch, and Goins, names that appear again and again in the earliest Melungeon court records, and whose modern descendants, in DNA test after DNA test, carry the same underlying signal. African paternal ancestry, European maternal ancestry, entering the record generations before the plantation slave trade, would have made such a union recognizable under the categories history books use. Imagine standing on a ridge above Newman's Ridge in Hancock County, Tennessee, the namesake settlement most closely tied to the earliest documented Melungeon families. Below you, hollows fold into hollows, thick with oak and rhododendron, the kind of terrain that made this corner of the Cumberlands nearly invisible to 18th century colonial authority. Somewhere down there, a family in the 1790s built a cabin, cleared a garden plot, and quietly stopped answering questions about where they came from, because the honest answer was no longer safe to give out loud. 230 years later, a descendant of that same family sits at a kitchen table in that same county, opens an email from a DNA testing company, and reads a result that names, in clinical genetic language, the exact thing their ancestors built an entire mountain silence around. Consider what this means for the descendants living today, many of whom grew up completely unaware, raised within a firmly white Appalachian identity, sometimes for 6 or 7 generations. Sometimes with family stories insisting instead on Portuguese or Native American blood, anything but the truth the DNA was quietly holding. When Melungeon descendants have received these results in recent years, genealogists working with these communities describe a reaction that is rarely simple shock. It is closer to recognition of something half-known. Family names that never quite made sense. Legal disputes over land and voting rights in the 1800s that hinted at something unspoken. A grandmother's offhand comment about Portuguese blood that was never quite convincing, even as a child. The DNA did not introduce a new story. It confirmed one that had been circling the edges of these families for 200 years, disguised as legend because the truth had once been too dangerous to say aloud. Some descendants have pushed back hard against the findings, and that reaction deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. Genealogist Roberta Estes, one of the authors of the 2012 study and herself a Melungeon descendant, has written about receiving hostile responses from within the community itself. People who grew up with the Portuguese or native narrative as a core part of family identity, and who experienced the African ancestry finding not as liberation, but as an unwelcome rewriting of who they believed themselves to be. That tension is itself part of the story. It shows how thoroughly the original cover story worked, and how much psychological weight 2 centuries of enforced silence can leave behind, even after the danger that created the silence is long gone. There is still a great deal the genetics cannot resolve. The exact African regions of origin for these earliest paternal lines remain difficult to pin down with precision, since the transatlantic slave trade's own records were kept by people with no interest in preserving specificity. What the DNA does resolve, and resolves unambiguously, is the shape of the story. Not shipwrecked Portuguese sailors, not a lost tribe of Israel. A frontier population of African, European, and likely indigenous ancestry, formed in a brief historical window before American race law closed that window permanently. And then driven into the mountains not by chance, but by the machinery of racial classification itself. What the Melungeon story ultimately reveals is larger than one Appalachian population. It exposes how much of what Americans have called pure ancestry, in any direction, white, black, or otherwise, was never as clean as the paperwork claimed. Race in early America was not a biological fact waiting to be recorded. It was a legal fiction, actively constructed and enforced, and populations like the Melungeons are the visible fracture line where that fiction failed to hold. Their grandchildren spent 2 centuries being told fairy tales about Turkish traders and lost colonies, because the real answer would have required the country to admit something about itself that it was not ready to admit. The DNA did not just find where the Melungeons came from. It found the seam where America's racial categories were sewn shut, and it pulled the thread. History isn't only written in books. Sometimes it is written in the silence a family keeps for 200 years, and it takes a laboratory to finally break it.